Think of the people you interact with every day. Would you want to spend a day in a canoe with them? Hi, I'm Nathan Mercero, CEO of Planning Alternatives. We're a disruptive brand in the financial planning space with a point of view that true wealth has nothing to do with money. Growing up in a small town in Canada, I experienced examples of families with money and without. It started me on this journey of understanding wealth and the idea that spending a day in a canoe with someone could be one of the best investments you could make. Join me as I sit down with leaders, entrepreneurs, creatives, rule breakers, and friends to discover their perspective of true wealth. And maybe you'll start to shift yours. Well, I'm delighted today to be joined by Dr. Corey Seemiller. Dr. Seemiller currently serves as an award-winning faculty member in the Department of Leadership Studies and Education and Organizations at Wright University. And Dr. Seemiller has been at the forefront of research about Gen Z. And it is a generation that I am fascinated by, primarily because I have two daughters who are Gen Zs. And I'm like, how do I figure them out more? But Dr. Seemiller has published 6 books: Generation Z Goes to College, Generation Z Leads, Generation Z A Century in the Making, Generation Z Learns, Generation Z Around the World, and Generations in the World of Work, as well as the Gen Z Voices on Voting Report. So welcome, Dr. Seemiller, and love to hear your insights. You've spent years studying Gen Z. What feels different about them in that generation compared to previous generations that has drawn your attention to a closer examination?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on. This was the million-dollar question back in 2013 when I started studying them. I was working at a university at the time, and I just noticed there was something different about the students that were coming in for our summer orientation. They seemed to be more interested in kind of community impact, how they can create like large scale social change. They were asking me lots of questions. I was working for a leadership program. We were recruiting students. And so they were asking me these questions all about how they were going to change the world and how would this program help them do that. And, not saying that millennials and Gen Xers before them didn't ask important questions, but this was just a new question. And I thought, oh, this is really different. This is a generation that really wants to make some type of an impact or some type of a difference. And as my interest unfolded, so did my research endeavors. So by 2014, I had actually done my first research study with my co-collaborator, Dr. Megan Grace, and we started kind of cracking the code. This, a lot of focus on this generation has been on their sort of technical prowess, right? This idea that they're on apps and they're on social media and all this, and the digital piece of their identity, but that really leaves out a very, very large segment of who they are, which is really this kind of these social change initiators, incubators, inventors, and innovators. And they are willing to circumvent the systems we have in place, break the systems, check out of the systems to make real change. And so for me, that was the biggest thing that I noticed when I first started studying them. And frankly, that's something that I continue to notice all the way through today. We're talking 13 years after my initial interest.
I hear comments at times about Gen Z being an anxious group or anxious generation, or maybe a sense of entitlement and don't really understand the value of hard work. I think those are harsh judgments, but what are we not understanding about this generation that, whether we're Gen millennials or above, from a earlier generation standpoint, would be valuable to tune into?
Well, I mean, we didn't grow up at the era they're growing up. This is the part that I always get a kick out of when people are like, they're always on their phones. I'm like, we're always on our phones, right? Like if I was 16 and I had the ability to access a smartphone and I had an iPad and I had all sorts of the technology that they have, but that I was bombarded with information and now AI, and I had lived through a pandemic and all of these things when I was like 14 and 15 years old, I probably would be anxious too. And so you have to really understand that they are a reflection of their environment. They're also a reflection of their parental involvement. So if we don't like our kids collectively, we also have to look at some of the socialization tactics we've done. And I'm not saying necessarily any individual parent, but even just if you look at the changing dynamics of schools in the early 2000s, where we moved to a real strong focus on STEM, we took out collectively as a society, we took out recess. We made time between classes shorter. We took out art, music, all those kinds of activities that help students blow off steam, be able to learn interpersonal dynamics and skills. And then we get them when they're coming, into college or the workforce. And we're like, why don't you know how to interact with others very well? And why are you anxious? It's because they lived through a very turbulent time that we don't understand because we weren't 14, 15, 16 when it was happening to us. I was in my 40s when half this stuff was happening, and then turn around and we take away their coping ability, their coping mechanisms, right? Like interpersonal connection in schools, and there's a reduction in the number of kids playing school sports today. So it's a factor of both of those things, and so we have to look and sort of recalibrate what can we do externally to help support this generation and be able to thrive. And there's no blame to be said, because we thought everything we do, I know that people try to do with good intentions, but at the same time, when we see the collective effects of it, we start backing up. STEM is now turned into STEAM, right? Gen Alpha is getting more art and music back in the curriculum because we realized that, as a society, we over calibrated that. So there's a lot of things that contribute to why a particular group of people acts a certain way. But this for Gen Z is really telling. You just have to look at what's happened over their short history of life.
Now, I spend time working with families on addressing an elephant in the room topic, which is the topic of money.
Mhm.
And often I find that there's one, maybe two at most, leaders within the family unit that will kind of take the proverbial microphone and talk about the topics and and granted, they could have just a natural curiosity about it, but sometimes it really drowns out the other voices in the room. And so my hope is that we can evolve the conversations that families have around this topic of money, almost as just simply recognizing that we all have a relationship with this topic and engaging on that basis of discovery. How how do we talk better to each other or clearer to each other between generations so that we're not always amplifying our differences or what isn't? What's the bridge that can be built?
I mean, there's two approaches. One is you can find the commonalities, right? You can find the common value threads. We're all interested, for instance, a family in saving money for a trip at the end of the year. It could be some kind of shared value that cuts across ages. And that works. And that also works in the workplace too, where you find out, we're all in this for achievement or success, or we want to put a good product out, or whatever the case may be. So coming to terms with what those common values are can go a long way. The other part of it is really leveraging the differences, though. Instead of seeing them as as a kind of a setback or an obstacle, you see them as useful, right? A you have sitting in a situation with a family where you might have various vantage points, is really allowing everyone to turn take in speaking, and creating a more formal structure for that, which allows some people who might not speak up the ability to speak up a little bit more. And so you can hear people's different perspectives depending on what's kind of at top of mind for them. And that also may not just be ideas, but it may be skill sets, right? There may be someone in the family that's much more prone to maybe using spreadsheets and all sorts of tracking things, and loves the idea of looking at money through this idea of just kind of numbers, right? Whereas other people might be looking at this idea of money as in what can it leverage us in terms of our own security. And so really kind of finding out. And I mean, I know it's hard if you have like young kids to try to figure that out, but they a lot of them understand this kind of stuff. Even my daughter, it was really interesting. When she was 12, she actually asked me for our tax identification number, and I said, what are you doing? Like, I don't know what you need this for. She said, well, I created my own Pinterest page, and I'm doing a thing where I'm collecting little images of fall fingernail designs, and then people click on it, and then they go to the site, and if they pay for something, I get like some revenue from that. And I said, how did you figure that out? And she's like, well, you do entrepreneurial work, so I'm going to do entrepreneurial work. And so I had no idea that was an interest of hers. And she's a real, like, she's got this head for entrepreneurship that is just amazing. But she was only 12 at the time. So you'd be surprised to know what kids are thinking about money. And she said something. She said, I always hear you say, Mom, that the best way to make money is while you sleep. And I thought, okay, all right. And I was like, there you go. So I think the idea is that we also don't know what everybody sort of brings to the table, and having those conversations can be really important.
I love that. I've also noticed And I'm looking for validation of this is might be a reasonable observation, which is it seems that Gen Zers have a significant amount of influence within their family unit. And I define that as upward influence. So where they might suggest people go on vacation as a family, or maybe some fun activities, and it's their vote or their voice that seems to carry a lot of weight. Have you observed anything like that, or is that just my house?
Well, I mean, there is some truth to that on a larger level. And I think part of that is because kids in particular have the ability with social media and the internet to be much more well informed about options. So if I were a kid and I were trying to suggest where to go for a vacation, I wouldn't even know where to begin. But kids now, will Google things or look things up, watch YouTube videos or hear things on social media about cool places to go or watch things on Instagram and say, "Hey, how about this?" And so it might not necessarily be the power, but they actually have ideas to contribute, which become viable if they're interesting enough for everybody to consider. So I think part of that is information is power, and they have a lot of that. I also know that the relationship that Gen Zers have with their parents is more of a mentor relationship where they see their parents as mentors, but also if leveraged, really well, it could be a co-mentoring where, parents are learning from their kids and kids are learning from their parents. It's a very interesting parental dynamic that we haven't seen in previous generations. And so parents are more open to saying, okay, I don't know how to do this, or I don't know I don't know what to look at, so you tell me. And so I'll have my daughter look up things for vacations and give me ideas. What do you think? And you research it and then you pitch it to me. I even at one point in time with decision making around whether or not to buy a treadmill, she wanted to buy a treadmill and I said, okay, you need to look up all this information and give me a PowerPoint presentation, 3 points about why we should buy a treadmill and 3 points about why we shouldn't buy a treadmill. And then you can put it on your Apple AirPlay on our TV and you could do a formal presentation to me. And she did. She did. She was like 11 years old. And so I think part of that, and it's just sort of my quirky ways of doing things, but also it's like there's much more opportunity for kids to be able to be involved in understanding and learning things. And by her thinking about the pros and cons, by the time she was done with the presentation, she actually said, "You're right. I don't think we should be getting this treadmill." And that wasn't what I was doing. I was actually just really open to it, kind of leaning towards no, but she was able to discover that. So her voice was really prominent because of the way she goes about kind of investigating things thoroughly as well.
I think a cat or two has landed inside of our home unit thanks to a solid PowerPoint presentation that was compelling enough to
So you have
open the
PowerPoint
doors.
presentations too, huh?
Yeah, yeah, I started that a while ago. Uh,
Yeah.
and just thinking back last year, we took a family vacation to South Florida, and I asked our daughter Allison, who was excited about the vacation, "Hey, why don't you find a location?" And she did, went to VBRO, and we looked at some options and screenshotted a few things, and I gave the
Mhm.
okay, and she booked it. So that's an example of someone who's just very efficacious in getting things done and navigating a tech world, which I think that's part of the influence factor because this is a truly digital generation that their scope and skill around technology matters, I think, is superior to previous generations. So
Yeah.
kind of by default that shows up in interesting ways. Now, you hit on a very interesting point about mentorship. So unpack, if you would, how this expectation is created between a child and a parent around mentorship, and then how parents or even influencers, relatives could help younger generations as a mentor or cultivate that.
Well, one of the things that's interesting is when you look at one generation, you have to sort of look at the trends of the generations that came before them, right? Because how the parental generation was raised is typically influences how they then go on and raise their children. It was interesting because a good portion of the vast majority of Gen Zers are parented by Gen Xers. Not all, but a vast majority are. And Gen Xers are a really distinct generation. They were they were allowed to be very hands off, very independent. I mean, we always joke about, we drank out of water hoses and like nobody knew where we were for 3 days. Like, and that was sort of the defining thing of Gen X. And then those of us who survived say, well, we survived, so we're okay. When we watched millennials come of age, those were kids we were babysitting for, or maybe we're teachers or educators and we see them in our classrooms, we saw a much more tightening around the parenting of that generation. And so what ended up happening was that they were very much helicopter parented. And Gen Xers, when they saw that, many of them were like, absolutely not. When I have my kids, that's not going to be how I'm doing it. I want to be involved. I want to have an influence, but I do not want to be making decisions for them. And helicopter parenting came out of I don't want to bash it. It came out of a good intention, but it ended up not really, manifesting in ways that were as productive for either party. But so what's ended up happening is Gen Xers with their kind of hands off, kind of more independent, has been doing a little bit more free range parenting with kids than previously with millennials. So with that said, you're seeing that these kids are able to make more decisions for themselves. They're empowered to do things like put together PowerPoints, and they're also their voice is given a say. And because of that, it creates much more of a relationship with the parents where they see them as kind of coaches or mentors to ask advice to. But if the parents aren't making the decisions for them and just asking them the right questions and guiding them along to make their decisions, they're seeing that as a mentoring relationship. It was interesting. My former institution where I worked, we had summer orientation, and when we had primarily millennials there, we had a lot of parents that would go with their students to their academic advising meetings where the students would pick their majors, and they were basically picking the majors for the kids. And so there was this idea that maybe we distract the parents and let their students make these choices. Well, by the time Gen Z came to college, a lot of them are saying, well, why aren't my parents in the room? Why did you plan the barbecue at the same time for the parents that I'm in my academic advising appointment? I want my parent to be there. I want to ask them important questions. They're not going to tell me what major to pick, but they're going to help me bounce ideas while I'm sitting in that meeting. And so that's just kind of how they were raised by their again, primarily Gen X parents. And again, I'm not saying there aren't helicopter parents in Gen X and that, but these are sort of these trends that we see. And because of that, it's created this sort of mentoring dynamic. And now that these young people are getting older and they're in the workforce, you're seeing it as kind of a mutual mentoring where, older folks are looking to Gen Zers to mentor them, not just teach them how to, hook up their wireless printer. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about actual true mentoring where these Gen Zers are helping older folks see things like work-life balance, and other really important concepts that you need in the workplace. So we're seeing that coming in as Gen Zers are moving into their young adulthood.
As we get ready to wrap up, I had mentioned a number of published books that you've authored. What's one book or one concept that really surprised you as you were going through your research and putting together out of your whole stable of books? What stands out?
Well, the thing that stands out most to me is there's a book called Gen Z Around the World, and we had done a global study of Gen Z. We had more than 30,000 participants worldwide. We had 32 research teams on the ground in various countries, like local researchers, and we collected a bunch of data about Gen Z. We had the same survey. We translated it in 19 languages. It was culturally translated for every nation it went to. We pitched the idea to a publisher before we even launched and said, hey, we want to basically write a book about how Gen Z is different in different areas of the world. And we got the thumbs up. We got the data back, and we found literally very, very, very little difference on any measure and across any of the countries and regions of the world. Surprised us that, young people in Botswana had a lot of similarities to Singapore and Ecuador and Belgium and US, and so it was very, very interesting. I mean, there are some little blips of differences, but by and large, there was way more similarities. So we had to actually go back to the publisher and say, we're going to write a book about how they're way more similar than they are different. And we can attribute that to things like globalization. And we wrote this book after the height of COVID, so certainly the impact of COVID politically, and from a kind of a social movement perspective, we see a lot more coordinated efforts, social media, things like that. But we didn't realize that effect was going to be so pronounced that as we kind of move through generations, we're probably going to see a lot more similarities across demographics within a generation than we have previously been used to.
Speaking of books, I see over your left shoulder the Soulmate Strategy. What is that about?
Oh, well, that is my latest book. That's actually has nothing to do with any of my research. Um, It's a book, it's a memoir that I wrote. It was a journey, my 1 year journey post a horrible breakup and all the wacky things I tried to do with my type A personality to heal, move on, and find the one. And I created a 44-point checklist. And I said, if I can do these things, I'm going to heal and I'm going to find my love. And as you can imagine, someone like me, type A, and that works really well in my work life and in my profession. But it doesn't work quite the same in a personal life. So there's quite an irony to the book. It's very vulnerable, and it just puts reality of heartbreak out into the world for people to see, that they're not alone. But at the same time, it's the irony is that all the things I really the effort and the process I tried to conquer heartbreak and find love definitely doesn't work the same as it does professionally.
Thank you for being courageous and stepping into the space of vulnerability to share that. That's going to help a lot of people. I want to thank you for your time today. You've been an invaluable resource and appreciate your insight on helping us move forward in our humanity. At the end of the day, we're all human, and there's opportunities every moment to connect with one another at a deeper level. So I appreciate your insight today.
Well, great. Well, thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a review. To discover what wealth means to you, please take our assessment at planningalt.com.